The night had a strange weight to it, the kind that pressed against the skin like damp air before a storm, thick enough to muffle sound yet sharp enough to amplify unease. The quiet suburb, with its manicured lawns and identical rooftops, looked peaceful from afar, but beneath its calm exterior pulsed a tension that felt unnatural, almost staged. Streetlights flickered with odd hesitation, shadows held their shape a second too long, and the silence moved like it had intention. On the edge of this picture-perfect neighborhood stood a house that never fully blended in, not because of its structure but because of the aura surrounding the man who lived inside. He wasn't the type the neighbors understood, nor the type they liked trying to understand. His presence didn't match the HOA's obsession with conformity, and his quiet confidence unsettled those who relied on control. A few residents whispered theories, judging him by the color of his skin before they ever judged him by his actions. They created stories to justify their discomfort, weaving fear into gossip until it hardened into resentment. On this particular night, resentment decided to manifest. A pair of vehicles rolled slowly through the cul-de-sac, stopping without headlights, like predators studying their prey. Their decals were amateurish attempts at authority, mock imitations of law enforcement meant to intimidate rather than protect. The men who stepped out wore mismatched tactical gear and clumsy badges that reflected the light with a cheap, metallic gleam, badges issued not by a government but by a homeowners committee inflated with power. This was not real law enforcement. This was a self-appointed patrol operating under the HOA's fabricated security division, Oak Ridge Community Enforcement Unit. Their boots crushed the gravel with heavy, deliberate steps, as if compensating for the authority they lacked. They moved in formation, pantomiming procedures they must have rehearsed in someone's garage. Each carried a sense of eagerness, excited to exert control, excited to enforce their invented rules, excited to target the man who had never bowed to their hostility. Their movements were swift, but their intentions dripped with pettiness. The neighborhood remained dark, but windows cracked open ever so slightly, curtains shifted, and eyes watched the unfolding scene with the hunger of spectators waiting for chaos. This was entertainment for those who convinced themselves they were simply protecting the community. A cold wind passed through the street, as if the night itself tried to warn them. Inside the house, the man they intended to intimidate was finishing his quiet routine, unaware of the farce assembling outside but instinctively attuned to the shift in atmosphere. He lived with a level of awareness sharpened not by paranoia but by experience. Years of training, years of navigating a world where prejudice could become danger without warning. He had long learned the difference between real threats and performative ones, but tonight's felt like both. As the fake officers spread out across his yard, their radios crackled with static, trying and failing to mimic professional communication. They motioned toward the door with the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. They were ready to make an example of him, ready to assert dominance, ready to weaponize their bias in the name of community safety. What they didn't know, what would change everything, was that the man they were targeting wasn't merely a resident. He wasn't someone they could scare, corner, or control. Behind his calm exterior lived a truth that would unravel their entire operation. Because while they played pretend, he belonged to an institution that did not. He was a federal agent under the FBI, a man trained to expose corruption, dismantle unlawful groups, and uncover the rot hiding behind false authority. And tonight, he was about to see exactly how deep that rot ran. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. Morning arrived with the kind of stillness that felt dishonest, a polished quiet masking what had unfolded only hours before. The neighborhood awakened as if nothing unusual had happened, pretending its world still operated under normal rules. Yet beneath the calm surface lay the residue of last night's intrusion, boot marks pressed into the dew-covered grass, faint tire impressions on the pavement, and an unsettled energy clinging to the air like smoke after a distant fire. The man at the center of it all stepped outside with the same composed routine he carried every day, though his senses remained alert. He noticed everything: the disturbed soil, the lingering scent of engine fumes, the unnatural silence from houses where blinds had quietly shifted during the night. He had always felt observed here, always felt judged for standing out in a community built on sameness. But last night was different. What once hid behind passive aggression had now crossed into action. The supposed patrol, those men posing as authority, hadn't simply wandered onto his property. Their movements, however amateurish, were intentional. Their timing was calculated. Their presence was a symptom of something festering much deeper in the neighborhood, resentment fueled by prejudice, sharpened by groupthink, and emboldened by false power. It wasn't about a rule violation. It wasn't about community safety. It was about control, about reminding someone who looked like him that he didn't fit the mold they worshipped. He understood this pattern all too well. He had seen it during investigations in towns where discrimination seeped quietly into everyday life until it hardened into institutional behavior. He had witnessed how ordinary people could adopt uniforms, titles, and fabricated authority just to justify their biases. And now, for the first time in months, he felt those same patterns closing in on his own home. Inside, he reviewed the signs again, piecing together the psychological profile of the group pretending to enforce the neighborhood's will. Their equipment carried the smell of new fabric and cheap plastic, suggesting recent formation. Their formation and forced confidence hinted at insecurity rather than training. Their eagerness revealed a desire not for safety but for dominance. They weren't merely troublemakers. They were escalating. And escalation from people like them always came with consequences, especially when they believed their target had no protection, no authority, and no power beyond the walls of his home. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Because the man they chose to provoke was not only trained to confront people like them, he was trained to dismantle them entirely. By late afternoon, the neighborhood returned to its usual performance of normal life, cars rolling in from work, sprinklers misting across trimmed lawns, and residents pretending not to watch the man they had quietly marked as an outsider. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The stares lingered longer. The cold glances sharpened. The false smiles faded when his back turned. The previous night had emboldened certain people, and fear had begun to spread through others who sensed something was wrong but chose silence over involvement. He moved with deliberate calm, but his instincts stayed alert. Subtle things stood out. A cluster of residents whispering while glancing toward his driveway, an unfamiliar truck circling the block a little too slowly, and a notice slipped onto his door, not official, not legal, just another attempt to intimidate. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze, as if even the wind hesitated to touch it. While the neighborhood pretended indifference, the man walked the perimeter of his home, studying every sign of intrusion. He recognized the pattern instantly, testing boundaries, asserting pressure, watching for fear. Such groups always started small, first with presence, then with warnings, then with actions that escalated just enough to feel threatening while still offering plausible deniability. It was a rhythm he had seen before in communities where hostility simmered beneath polite facades. As evening settled in, the environment grew heavier. Several homes dimmed their lights but kept blinds parted just enough to track his movements. Down the street, a small group gathered near a mailbox, their posture rigid, their attention fixed on him even as they tried to disguise it with casual body language. Their unease wasn't random, it was preparation. Something larger was forming. He sensed the coordination behind it. Someone had given instructions. Someone had spread the story that he was a problem, a threat, an outsider who needed to be controlled. Prejudice alone didn't organize people this efficiently. Someone was orchestrating it. The air carried an electricity he recognized from field operations just before a planned move. The quiet was too sharp, the stillness too exact. The neighborhood wasn't simply observing him anymore, they were waiting. And as he stepped back inside his home, his instincts confirmed what his training already understood: the group from last night wasn't finished. Their first attempt had been a test. Their second would be a declaration. He prepared himself, knowing the darkness approaching wasn't random, it was intentional. And it was coming for him. Night descended without hesitation, swallowing the neighborhood in a heavy stillness that felt almost ceremonial, an orchestrated pause before something irreversible. The man sensed the shift long before the first sound reached him. His instincts, sharpened over years of field operations, recognized the tension tightening through the air like a drawn bowstring. The house seemed to breathe with him, every creak and echo magnified by the anticipation of what waited outside. Then it began. Vehicles rolled into the cul-de-sac with the slow confidence of people who believed they owned the darkness. Their headlights stayed off again, this time not to hide but to intimidate. Doors opened in unison, followed by the rhythmic thud of coordinated footsteps. But unlike the previous night, the group had grown. Their numbers had doubled, maybe tripled. Their gear had upgraded, from mismatched pieces to more carefully curated replicas of law enforcement uniforms. Their movements felt bolder, their posture firmer, their energy fevered with the thrill of power. This wasn't a patrol. This was a mob convinced it had authority. They fanned out across his yard, staging themselves with exaggerated precision, as if preparing for a televised raid. Some carried handmade shields painted with community slogans meant to mask hostility behind civic language. Others held imitation batons or lights meant to mimic tactical equipment. Their breathing was heavy, their adrenaline palpable. They had convinced themselves they were acting for the good of the neighborhood, when in reality, they were acting from fear, pride, and prejudice. Inside the house, the man remained steady. His calm wasn't the result of ignorance or arrogance. It was the product of training, discipline, and the knowledge that truth stood on his side. He observed their positions through subtle vantage points, analyzing angles, numbers, and movement patterns with the focus of someone who had dismantled far more dangerous operations than this one. Yet this moment felt heavier, not because of the threat, but because of the hatred fueling it. The group formed a semicircle at his front steps, their stance rigid, their intentions unmistakable. They believed this was their moment to assert dominance. They believed they were cornering someone powerless. But they had no idea who they were standing against. The man stepped forward with quiet certainty, carrying the weight of federal authority not as a shield but as truth. When the moment arrived, when the confrontation peaked into absolute silence, everything shifted. The men outside froze. Because in that instant, they finally realized the truth they had never prepared for. They had not surrounded a victim. They had cornered a federal agent. The night didn't shatter with noise. It collapsed into silence, a deep, hollow quiet that spread across the cul-de-sac like a shockwave. The men who had arrived ready to intimidate now stood frozen in place, their makeshift uniforms and counterfeit badges suddenly feeling as fragile as paper in a storm. Their confidence melted into confusion, then dread, as the realization took root. They had crossed a line far beyond their understanding. And the world was no longer on their side. As the federal response moved swiftly into motion, quiet, controlled, and unmistakably real, the neighborhood watched from shadowed windows. This was no longer a spectacle fueled by rumor and bias. This was accountability unfolding in real time. The false authority the group had clung to evaporated under the weight of legitimate power, dissolving into fear no bravado could disguise. The man at the center of it all remained steady. His presence wasn't triumphant, and it wasn't vengeful. It was resolute, defined not by anger but by purpose. He had seen communities rebuild after worse. He had watched prejudice dismantled thread by thread. He understood that justice wasn't loud. It was deliberate, methodical, and sometimes painfully quiet. And tonight, justice had found its target. As each member of the fake enforcement group was removed from the scene, the neighborhood's collective silence deepened. Their earlier whispers had been replaced by uneasy reflection. Their assumptions, their gossip, their quiet complicity, all of it now hung in the air like a fog they could no longer pretend wasn't there. The man walked his property once more when the dust settled. The yard felt different now, no longer a battlefield of intimidation but a reminder of the line he had drawn simply by standing firm. The night breeze carried away the remnants of fear, replacing it with a calm he hadn't felt since moving there. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like clarity. He knew the incident would ripple through the community, forcing uncomfortable conversations and necessary changes. He knew some would learn from it, while others would hide behind silence. Racism rarely vanished overnight, but it weakened when confronted by truth, exposed under a light it couldn't escape. The house behind him stood quiet, steady, and unshaken. And as he stepped inside, one truth lingered like a final echo. Power built on fear collapses. Power built on justice endures. What would you have done if the darkness outside your door wasn't pretending, but knocking?